But maybe we can just start with, talking about your first book that you published with a small press. Remind me what it is.
Word Hermit Press.
Word
Yeah.
Hermit Press. Yeah. So maybe you can just talk about the process of like deciding that your story was ready and you were like, now what? How do I get this published?
Okay. So it's fiction. I worked on it for 2 or 3 years. I rewrote it probably 10 times. It's a paranormal historical thriller. So in 2011, 2012, 2013, when I was working on that book, there really wasn't a genre for that. So I managed to get a slot with a collection of big agents and editors from traditional places in New York and workshopped the book, and everybody was excited about it. This is so unique. It's going to be so great. You have to pitch us when it's ready, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
And so I pitched it to about 100 different agents
Oh, wow.
in late 2012, early 2013, mid 2013, and got universally rejected.
Wow.
While they were excited about my premise and all how unique it was, when it came down to it, they all said, it's too unique. We don't know how to sell this. We don't know where to slot this. We want you to change it to be something else so that it'll be easier to slot, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I had worked on the book for 3 years. I felt very passionately about the story.
Yeah.
And so I really didn't want to change it
Good. Yeah.
on the promise that somebody would represent it if I did this and this and this, because agents will also say that, and then you do this and this and this and send it back to them, and they're like, oh well, I've already moved on now and I'm not interested in this anymore.
Right. Yeah. It's like you are doing basically free labor that you maybe wouldn't want to do otherwise just to try to make
Right.
money or yeah.
Right. So my husband had a connection to someone who's big in the publishing industry. He had started a small press already and had published someone else's book. And so he published the book
Word
in,
Hermit Press. Yeah.
yeah, in February of 2014. That book came out. And I decided to walk the Natchez Trace Parkway where that book was set to be promotion for this novel. I thought it would
Oh,
garner all
wow.
this attention. I thought I was so smart. People would be covering it in the news because it's a highway. Nobody walks this highway. So I thought I was just the smartest author ever.
Yeah, right.
I would get all this attention. I was an idiot. But I ended up having this, bittersweet kind of schizophrenic adventure with my 80-year-old dad. And I didn't intend to write a book about that when we did the walk. I never wanted to write a memoir. But it ended up being a story that I thought was universal enough and had enough appeal to other people who had dysfunctional relationships, because we all have them. And so I thought that's the reason to tell the story. It's not about me. It might help other people make connections with difficult people in their lives.
Right.
And so somebody was walking the Natchez Trace behind me. I considered pitching it to a bigger publisher or trying to get an agent. But given that I didn't know what that other person's intentions were for their walk, I didn't want them to beat me to market with a story about walking the Natchez Trace. So Word
Oh,
Hermit
interesting.
published
And
that book.
did you know that they were a writer?
I didn't know what they were doing, and I didn't want to ask
Oh, that's so funny.
because I didn't want to tip them off to my intentions or whatever.
Mm.
So I wanted to get to market first and have the first story.
Yeah. And do you feel like you're glad? Did you see anything afterwards about a hike
No,
or?
I didn't. I actually talked to the guy afterwards.
Oh, you did. Oh, cool.
But I and he's never done anything with his story, but at the time you don't know. So I wanted to make
Absolutely.
sure that I got mine to market first. So that is one of the advantages of doing it with a really small press. You don't have so many layers of bureaucracy to go through. You can turn around a book really quickly
Mm-hmm.
and get it to market.
Yeah,
It
how
is
long did it take, like, from starting to write it to press date? Like,
8 months.
oh, wow. And normally, for context, like a big publishing house is like 3 years or
It
something.
can take 2 years or
Yeah,
more,
yeah.
depending.
Wow.
You need nowadays 6 to 8 months of lead time just to start promoting the book in advance of its publication with a big publisher.
Right. Wow, that's wild.
So
Wow. Okay. So you had this new book and you'd already kind of done like a little bit of like marketing with this small publishing house. Cause I guess the smaller publishers, they are maybe not going to have the budgets for marketing and they maybe don't even have a marketing team. Is that kind of true or?
that's true, but that's true of mid-sized publishers and bigger publishers too, depending on where
Yeah.
they classify you on their scale of ABC writers.
Okay.
So, you know, even with a big press, even with Random House, if they think you're a C writer in their roster, you're going to be hiring your publicist and you're going to be paying for your book tour
I
and
see.
you're going to be managing your marketing. They're not going to give you a marketing team.
Right. And in terms of like the overhead of working with a small publisher, so you had that whole cost, which probably you would have had anyway, but then did you have to put any money into like the publishing of the book
No,
or, okay,
no.
that's great. So that's a benefit of working with like a smaller press
I
versus
did
the,
pay for my editor,
oh, okay.
but I didn't have to. It was nice that I could pick my editor.
Right.
A big publisher might assign you an editor that you don't have a synergy with.
Right. Or I've heard too that part of getting publications or getting a publisher is having an editor that's like, well, like they have a good CV, like that they've worked with people who have actually gotten published, and
Mhm.
that actually kind of helps you get published as like working with certain people to produce. Um,
It depends. It's all a
yeah,
crapshoot. So much has changed at the
right.
publishing houses. You could end up with a really great editor that you just click with,
Yeah.
or you could end up having 5 or 6 different editors,
Interesting. Fun.
because they just shuttle you around. I have a friend who had a book deal. It was a nonfiction book coming out with a major press. They changed editors on him 3 or 4 times.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They promised that he would have pre-publication copies and that they would manage sending out all the pre-publication copies, the galleys, so that it could get advanced reviews. He
Mm-hmm.
used his own money to organize a book tour
Oh, wow. Okay.
around the time that the book was published, and then they didn't do the pre-publication copies. They just forgot or
Oh,
didn't think
wow.
it was important.
Mm-hmm.
And
Um,
so
and
he
did
was sitting
he,
there with a book tour schedule that he sunk a bunch of money into, and he didn't have any pre-publication anything.
oh, wow, to like kind of share.
Yeah.
The- and did he get to choose like his title? I remember hearing that
No,
Toni Morrison like didn't even like they weren't going to let her choose the title of her book.
nobody does. Nobody
Yep.
gets to choose their titles at that
That's so
level.
wild. It makes
Or
no
your cover.
sense.
You have
Right.
virtually no input on your covers.
I've heard that some people do actually. I was just at an artist talk at Skylight Books, or a writer's talk, and she actually her recent book was called like Aesthetica. And I don't
Mhm.
know what size publisher she worked with, but she actually, I think it was her second book, and she got to collaborate with the publishing house on the design of her cover. So
Mhm.
maybe things have changed for the better in some
Yeah.
areas.
Yeah. It depends. It really depends on where they classify you and what kind of book it is, and
Hmm.
and how much of an advance they've given you, and how
Right.
There's just so many different things that go into whether they are going
To give you any like
to give you any.
leeway.
My
Yeah.
Korean memoir, translation, we sold the rights and I never heard another word about it.
Oh,
I
wow.
never saw the cover. They didn't even tell me when it was published.
Wow.
So
So did you just Google it or how'd you find out?
yeah, I knew. I was
Amazing.
like, this thing has got to have been done by now.
Yeah, because I
It had
remember
been out
seeing a
for a month.
copy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's so
So
funny. Well, and you're like, I'm not exactly gonna go through and like edit your Korean. So
right.
yeah.
But I was promised 6 copies of it. They never sent those.
Oh wow. Okay.
We asked my agent in Korea multiple times to get them. Nobody ever got them. So I've never seen the book.
Yeah, wow. That's wild. I wanted to ask about that book which the name of the book that we're talking about right now is your second book, and it's called Not Without My Father, One
Yes.
Woman's 444-mile walk of the Natchez Trace, which really quick, like for people who don't know, what is the Natchez Trace?
The Natchez Trace is a 10,000-year-old road that runs from Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee.
Got it.
It's called a trace because it was a migratory route for animals starting 10,000 years ago or so when the glaciers retreated.
Oh wow.
And when indigenous peoples came to this continent, they settled along it because they could follow their migrating food supply. So
I
it's
see.
one of those really ancient things that we have as Americans, but we don't celebrate really ancient things. We treat history like, 300 years or so.
No, totally. America's so new. It's kind of wild. Like,
Yeah,
especially living in California, like everything is like 100 years old or less.
but we have really ancient things. So this is
Mm,
one of those things.
yeah.
That book has been interesting to Europeans and people in the UK because there aren't many books that are written by American writers that celebrate these ancient things.
Oh, interesting. Well, and so that was the book that was turned into a Korean translation.
Yeah.
And that was also the book that became a New York Times bestseller,
Yeah.
which, you know, felt like when I heard that story, I was kind of taken aback at like, the story of David and Goliath or something where, you go with a small press, you've been rejected by all these agents, and then all of a sudden your book ends up there, which like, how does a book even end up on the New York Times bestseller list?
Well, nobody really knows for sure.
Okay.
They guard exactly what they look at week to week and they change it
Mm,
periodically.
mm,
And the publishing world has changed so much and social media has changed so much. This book was on the New York Times bestseller list in October of 2015. So it's been a while
right.
since it hit a list, but I organized maybe 20 different promotions within a week's time.
Okay.
And I discounted the book and I sold 8,000 or so copies in a
Oh,
week
wow.
through all these different promotions. And that's
Cool.
how it wound up on the New York Times bestseller list.
Oh, wow. Amazing. And did you organize those with the bookshops or was that like a website thing
It was
or?
a website thing. I
Oh,
used different
wow.
websites and it was very, very effective.
Well, you should teach a class on that
Well, I
because
don't know that it would work as well today. This
sure.
was pay to play on
Right.
Facebook and Amazon.
Okay.
In 2016, both of those sites changed really to pay to play. It's very difficult now compared
Totally.
to before. So I was lucky in my timing
Mm,
also.
I see. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, and then the following books that you did, you have published two more in the series of your first book that's based on kind of the life and afterlife of Meriwether Lewis.
Yeah,
And so did you stay with the same publishing house for those
I
two?
did. I
Yeah.
did.
And has anything like shifted as you've done small printing, like that you've learned or anything that's come up in the subsequent two books?
Well, I had a pretty significant health issue in 2016,
Mm,
just as I was preparing my third book for publication. I had a big PR firm that was helping me
mm.
launch that book, and they did nothing.
Oh no.
They did nothing. They got one advance review for
Okay.
that. And it was, $10,000 that I spent of my own money.
I see. Okay.
And I was, not well and dealing with that. And that was the same year, in November of 2016 was the same year that Facebook changed their algorithm to pay to
Right.
play, and Amazon introduced their advertising service, which really destroyed authors' ability to reach
I see.
new
Okay.
readers, because everything you see on there now is an ad.
Right. Okay.
So before, my book had done well enough that people would see it and list and just say, well, this looks good, I'm going to buy it. But they never see it anymore because all of those slots are paid for.
I
So
see.
that happened in November 2016. And I have a spreadsheet where my sales, I could rely on that book. It had done so well, and my sales just went.
Oh no, the Amazon drop off.
Yeah. And
Ugh,
so I wrote one more book to finish that series up. And then we had the pandemic. So
right.
it's been an interesting journey
Mm.
to see how much it relies on me to constantly be thinking about what's next and what do I
And
do
doing the
next,
hustle.
anticipating what's going to change next and all of that.
Mhm.
So um that is going to be the case regardless of how you're published today.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, I just to compare it to like art life, I will say, you get a gallery and they take 50% of all your sales and they, depending on the size, potentially have an assigned marketing person who's there to like help you build your career, et cetera. But I do think there's a certain extent you're always having to advocate for yourself and build your brand, if you want to call it that, or whatever. Like you're the one in charge of your career. And I feel like also you've read, there's so many books and movies out there about people who do get those partners who then end up screwing them over anyway. And so I feel like it's a little bit of a false narrative that like you get your publishing house or you get your big editor and then everything's fine. You don't have to try as hard anymore. It's like you always have to try and you always kind of have to be in tune with like what works for yourself because
Mhm.
people's motivations for doing things are going to be different than yours, And so like making sure you're aligned at every step of the way, I think is like really important. And that's something I've like kind of tried to keep an eye on. Um, and like on that note, you kind of just to wrap up, like you have an agent now. You have gone back into the lion's den of the bigger publishing houses. Can you talk about like the choice to kind of go that route with this new book? And this is another nonfiction book, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So my agent reached out to me last May.
Okay.
And at first I said, no, I'm not interested
And how
in
did they hear
even
about
talking
you?
to him. I don't even know. But
Okay.
he reached out to me and said, you have this great New York Times bestselling memoir. I'd really be interested in talking to you about other projects you're working on.
Yeah.
And at first I said to myself, how many of these people have jerked me around? I'm just not going to talk to him.
Okay.
But then I looked him up and thought I might as well talk to him. So we had a conference call that really didn't go very well because I was in Spain and he was on the subway in New York.
Oh, funny.
And so it kept cutting out. But he essentially told me that the reason that the novel that I had written kept getting rejected was because I was known for my nonfiction and that's where I'd had success. And so the
Oh,
traditional
interesting.
publishing industry saw me as a nonfiction writer. So if I
Mm.
could turn that book into a nonfiction book, he would represent me. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. So we went several more months without talking. I pitched him something else. He said, no, that's not what I want. And then Jeanette McCurdy published her book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, and it did so well, about a narcissist mother. And so I thought, this is the story I would tell, just from a, radicalized Christian nationalist upbringing.
Okay.
And so I worked on sample chapters to turn that fiction book, which was really just starting over, into a memoir about that.
Oh,
And so I pitched that to him in late January, and he agreed to represent me. So now we're in the process of trying to sell it. It's called Stick Mama. But it may not be called that in the end. I won't have any input on that, but that's
right. That's what it is right now. Amazing.
Yeah. So it's about my growing up with a narcissist mother in this very strict Christian nationalist, moral majority era church and school,
Wow. Yeah.
and how that led to where we are today in our country. It's very timely. It's not something I wanted to relive. It's not something I enjoy thinking about, but I already know from the pieces that have been published that it helps other people. It helps other people in red states who are worried about getting pregnant feel less alone.
Mhm.
It sent one person that I know of already to therapy.
Oh, wow. Like you sent her in advance or something.
No, she just read my piece and said, this is me right now. And
Oh, like one
I
of your
don't care.
essays that you've written.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that
So,
makes sense.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that's the reason to write a book like this. It's not because I'm dying to tell this story or be known for this, but I think it will be really helpful to people.
Right. Or, I mean, I think it's so scary to write about family, and it's hard to write about maybe family that's hurt you in a way that doesn't come off as just like like a retaliation for the years of trauma or whatever. But I think like what you're saying sounds like, a good reason because there is like a broader, more universal context. Have you
Oh,
thought about how family is
there's
going to respond?
there's not just that. I start the book with a scene from my mother's earlier life. I have a lot of empathy for my mother. She wouldn't agree with that, but I do. I understand why she is the way she is. And I want readers to understand that. It's a very sad thing. That still doesn't mean that I can have a relationship with her.
But she's a
But
product of like a larger socio-political context.
yeah, and it's impacted her. And I have real empathy for that, even if I can't have a productive relationship with her.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to definitely put a bunch of links in show notes and, um, you know, we'll introduce people to your book, like both in the essay and in the podcast. But thank you so much. And I'm going to end recording now, but
Okay.